Let's start with the current board of directors. What a motley crew. Let's leave the officers aside and just go to the board of directors. So as I mentioned, board of directors who are in charge of hiring and firing the president. Because this is one of the things, right? Like, as we talked about with the U.S. Institute of Peace, I think we talked about this in office hours. We could regime change the U.S. Institute of Peace because even though it held itself out as an NGO, it was technically kind of a U.S. government agency. It had mandatory board seats for the Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, the President of the National Defense University, and then 12 seats picked by the admin. NED is not structured that way. NED is structured to have full autonomy, and the main lever against it is its budget from the government and oversight by the government. So as we mentioned, Damon Wilson, the censorship architect of the Atlanta Council, who then became the president and CEO, the question is, well, you can't have this guy as president and CEO. How do you kick him out? Well, the answer is by a 2/3 vote of the board of directors. So you go, okay, well, who are the board? And by the way, as I mentioned, Damon Wilson has a higher salary as president and CEO of NED than the president of the United States. Damon Wilson makes almost $500,000. I think it's like $470 as president and CEO of NED, which is funded by our tax dollars. The Secretary of State only makes about $250. And the State Department is who funds the National Endowment for Democracy. So given that the State Department funds the National Endowment for Democracy, the State Department is its boss. It's who oversees it. It's who gets to see all the documents. It's who does the policy alignment. And it's who does not distribute the funds unless NED does what it says. So you have an employer-employee type relationship here. But the employee makes twice as much as the boss. Anyone who runs their own company out there, who's got independent contractors or W-2 employees, is there any employee who you pay twice as much a salary to than you pay to yourself? So the question is, okay, well, who determines Damon Wilson's salary? Well, it's set by the board of directors. So the government can't fire Damon Wilson. Only the board of directors can. The government can't change Damon Wilson's salary. Only the board of directors can. So the question is, okay, well, who runs the board of directors? I'm just going to point out some names. Ambassador Dan Fried.
Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again.
The biggest single recommendation in that paper is that Europe and the United States together bring together all the stakeholders, governments, social media companies, civil society, and come up with common standards, common approaches about how to deal with disinformation.
Within the sound of silence, in restless dreams I walk.
Secondly, how can I put this delicately? Much will depend on the content of what we learn, the nature of Russian interference and its relationship, if any, with the Trump campaign. Look, I'm old enough to remember Watergate. There will be a moment in the aftermath of whatever's coming when there will be a political necessity in this country, I suspect, to do something.
Governments, civil society, private organizations all have roles to play in limiting the damage.
We're far better off if we do it with Europe. So work it with Europe, work it hard now. And one final point. American politics is consumed with this issue. We are likely to have a moment of political possibility to address Russian interference in our election system and in our democracy. A moment of political momentum behind legislative solutions.
If there's any single person responsible for where I am today, I would say there's two people for everyone involved in the censorship industrial complex. the thousands of characters that added some little modicum of depth or awareness, changed my life in a little way. You know, you study these people long enough, they kind of become your friends. You know, you talk to them in the shower. You have imaginary conversations with them when you're on the toilet. You're out walking your Tamagotchi. You have a little pretend dog. You just start talking. I would say the two people, if I could really put a finger on it, that most changed my life trajectory in terms of my time studying them and what I learned just from learning from them would be Jared Cohen and Ambassador Dan Fried in different ways. I don't think I'd be here today if it weren't for this person. I can't imagine how I could have ended up here without Dan Fried. And, you know, spies are everywhere. I know these blobby group chats, because I have some spies in them, send me some of their messages. Dan, if you ever see this, no love lost. Actually, a little bit of personal gratitude. Your frankness really helped open doors for me mentally. I wish the best for you. I think you were involved in some pretty dirty things, though. But yeah, while you were doing all that shit, I was watching. And it's really like the character of Dan Fried that brought me into the government side of the censorship industrial complex more than any other person. Because even with Jared Cohen, while he started as State Department policy planning staff, the real guts of the story is what he did at Google Jigsaw. And that inside-outside story while Cohen was on the outside, coming from the inside. But Fried was an inside guy. And Fried always struck me as the smartest person in the room. I was always very impressed by Ambassador Dan Fried's ability to take the idiot sphere of many elements of the censorship industrial complex and to mold them to 501c3ify their language, to take their insane ideas and mold them into something actionable by the blob, to harness the enthusiasm of regulators and censors, but channel it into something that was politically possible. I learned, because, you know, you get these idiots in the space, right? You get like your Nina Jankovics, who are just like wind-up dolls. No original thoughts, all, you know, just, you're like, can you believe they said that? And sometimes I just imagine Nina saying something, or some of these other characters, and Dan Fried being in the back of the room being like, no, you weren't supposed to say it like that. No, you weren't. Don't tip our hand. You have to apply Diplo speak. And if they had put someone like Dan Fried in charge of the Disinformation Governance Board, a real operator, things may have worked out differently. So let me tell a story. Dan Fried was a 40-year veteran of the U.S. State Department. I think he served 8 different presidents or something. And he was the head of sanctions. He was the sanctions coordinator for Barack Obama at the State Department, while he, when the sanctions roadshow took off after the 2014 Crimea vote. So the two big foreign affairs, there were three. Right? There was the Russian reset. There was the Crimea. There was the Ukraine coup. There was the Eastern Ukraine breakaway and Crimea counter coup. And the Iran deal. Those were kind of and the Arab Spring. Those were kind of like the main foreign policy events of the Obama administration. But Ukraine is what really dominated things 2014 on. And Dan Fried's role was to work with all the different treasury, ministries of foreign affairs, regulators in foreign countries and get them to agree to sanction Russia, get them to agree to shoot their own foot in order to draw blood from Russia to help the United States and the UK and Canada and Norway and a few others continue the quest to conquer Eurasia. So this was the guy who was the top dog in rallying the whole of government response from foreign governments to get them to take a government action, sanctions. When Trump won the 2016 election, took office in January 2017. I remember this timeline crystal clear. 1 month into Trump's term, February 2017, Daniel Fried gives up his 40-year career at the State Department to become a director at the Atlantic Council. You'll notice this is once again this NATO, because the Atlantic Council is NATO's think tank, with 7 CIA directors on its board and funded by all the big military and big oil companies, as well as the U.S. military, the State Department, USAID, NED. You'll notice, just like the president and CEO of NED was the former number 2 at the Atlantic Council, so too do you have, in the form of Ambassador Daniel Fried, an Atlantic Council director on the board of NED. This is, again, this kind of NATO-CIA axis. And in February 2017, Fried goes from being the sanctions coordinator, officially, of the U.S. government, to being the censorship coordinator, unofficially, of the shadow government. He took that same set of skills, that same set of Rolodex contacts in foreign countries, and instead of coordinating them to put sanctions on Russia, he coordinated them to censor the internet, responding to the crisis of online disinformation. Kimmy, there's a great book about the early Jewish gangsters involved in the formation of Israel. And I think the book was called "But They Were Good to Their Mothers." Let's see if I can find that. They were good to their mothers. Yes. And that's what I think of. And I'm not trying to draw attention to the fact that he's Jewish. I'm Jewish too. But when I think of, because Daniel Fried, I suspect that he's got a loving family. I wish them all, healthy, long lives. But when you see Fried in action, he is the adult in the room. And yet it's a space that in 2017, you did not see many people of Fried's age. How old is he exactly? I don't want to be ageist. Let's see. Born in 1952. Okay, so he's 74 now. Yeah, retired, yep, February 2017. And what do you know, by the way? He was the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasian Affairs. Eurasia. Europe and Eurasia. Do you know who had that role right after him? Victoria Nuland. What, 2 slots after that? Victoria Nuland was also the Assistant Secretary for Europe and Eurasian Affairs. From 2013 to 2017. So Dan Fried was what, 2? He had that same role. He was the 23rd in that role. She was the 25th. Yep. So he was the Victoria Nuland before Victoria Nuland. So NED has, because NED also has Victoria Nuland on its board. So those are two former heads of Europe and Eurasia for the State Department. Did I tell you that Eurasia is the prize? Now, I don't want to spend the whole time on Fried because we could do a 20-hour lecture just on Fried and how he helped set up the censorship industrial complex. But what Fried really did is he really created that transatlantic connection between the censorship industrial complex in the US and the censorship industrial complex in Europe. He really got the ball rolling on what we today are up against with the EU Digital Censorship Act, the one that just fined X 140 million, the one that's cracking down on advertisers to stop you from being able to get advertiser income if you're a news site, the one that's probably going to levy billions of dollars of fines against X ahead of the next election cycle. That was in significant part, a Daniel Fried production. And I watched all this happen, and it completely shifted my mindset about how the world works, about how both formal and informal aspects of government work, how operations behind the scenes are planned and operationalized, how the NATO alliance really works, how government policies are coordinated across governments and what kind of networks they move through and how that all works logistically. So Dan, if you ever see this, consider me your student. I hope you're proud of me. I learned a lot from you, and I'm trying, almost like a father-son relationship, I'm trying to not make the mistakes that you did and try to set things right. And I think if you look deep down inside yourself, you'll acknowledge that you went too far in a few places. And there were certain key things that you probably knew in your heart of hearts you shouldn't have done. And you went ahead with it anyway. And you've left it to people like me and Elon Musk and Marco Rubio, I hope, and President Trump to clean up the mess that the world became with some of the things that you did. Now, let's see if I have. These are all on my old computer. Let's see if I can pull up just some examples of this. I mentioned this in one of my first big interviews that I did with Jan Jekielek, American thought leaders, Epic Times spin out, I think, on the censorship industrial complex. And I believe, let me just play something from, it's around the 43-minute mark.
And when they passed NetzDG, it compelled Facebook and YouTube to adopt artificial intelligence censorship techniques in order to comply with $54 million fines for leaving various kinds of content on their platforms that violated this new German law. And so once Facebook and YouTube had to adopt all this new AI, that had an immediate impact on that AI being redirected inward in the US context and in the UK context to counteract Brexit support. Now, Ambassador Fried was talking openly about this at his own disinformation conferences with European regulators, with national security officials, with extremely important and influential people who at the time were saying, Ambassador Fried, that sounds like a great idea, but it's just not enough. The Russians are only one component of this. These populists, they've taken on a life of their own. They seem to have their own independent interests. And Ambassador Fried is in the room telling them, listen, I understand, but in America, we can't just go from 0 to 1. We have to boil the frog.
I mean, as an old diplomat, the thing to do is to set up an informal mechanism, maybe formal, but start informal between the US, the EU, key shareholders, and bringing in the civil society, and then use that to have a conversation with the social media companies. Like, we've got a lot of leverage, we can use it. And they will adjust. Their culture is malleable. They will respond to the incentive structure that we set up if we do our job.
So what you just heard there, this was, I believe, in the disinformation conference that Daniel Fried set up at the Atlantic Council while Damon Wilson was the number 2 at the Atlantic Council. And he had regulators from all across Europe in the room, and they were saying, we need to ban anonymous accounts. There should be a driver's license to use social media. There should be criminal penalties for spreading misinformation. And Dan Fried is telling them, listen, you should do that in Europe. The United States can't do that because of the First Amendment. But if you get the ball rolling, it will create an international norm and standard. And then we can point to Europe as best practices, and we can begin to adjust American norms about freedom on the internet. At the same time, he's imploring them to use this idea of Russian disinformation as a hook. And they're saying, but Fried, Ambassador, the issue is not just the Russians. Or the Spanish Vox Party is rising in the polls. The German AfD Party is rising in the polls. Marine Le Pen is rising in the polls. The Five Star Movement in Italy is rising in the polls. It's not just Russia. I mean, it's domestic. And Fried is assuring them, listen, we will get there. The thing to do is to stand up this international alliance of governments and create a web of NGOs on the outside. If you listen back to it, you'll note what he says just in this, and I can play a million Fried clips.
I mean, as an old diplomat, the thing to do is to set up an informal mechanism, maybe formal, but start informal.
This is very important because this is what they did. You know, everyone who's always been like, Benz, where did he come from? He must be some industry plant from the CIA or whatever. And when I say, no, listen, I was chained for 10 years to the wheel of pain, just watching Dan Fried YouTube videos. This is what I mean. The reason that this came to public attention so much with the Disinformation Governance Board is because they formalized it there. What people didn't see were the informal mechanisms where you had a representative from government agencies and a dozen NGOs. And they said, this is just an informal consultation with civil society. But it's the government doing it. Now, it's non-binding. When civil society proposes that the government do this, the government is not formally committing to it. When the government pays the NGOs to go out and do the very dirty deed they just proposed to the government can say, well, we didn't know they were doing that, if you even get to catch them doing it. Informal is a very nasty little turn of phrase here. Informal is a way of saying plausibly deniable. First, you stand up informal means you can't FOIA it. If you FOIA the State Department or the Department of Homeland Security for all documents relating to countering disinformation or information integrity or the infodemic, information disorder, malinformation, we don't have any formal programs about that. By my records, to my knowledge, you can stand up and tell Congress under penalty of perjury. To my knowledge, we don't have any programs dealing with that whatsoever. No, you've got informal ones. This is what surprised me about the sedition hunters payment from the FBI. Wow, they formalized it. They formally paid them. Wow. That removes the plausible deniability layer. So he's telling them, listen, we can get leverage, but let's start with an informal alliance. Won't draw headlines. They won't see it coming. Let's build up this architecture. Let's create leverage for pressure. And then we'll have the conversation with the social media platforms about taking down Trump content, taking down pro-Marine Le Pen content, taking down Vox Party, AfD Party, PIS Party content. Once we've got it lined up through this informal period,
between the US, the EU, key shareholders, and bringing in the civil society.
This will be the spawn army, the army of pawns, the surround sound of media, academia, influencers, foundations, big foundation money, private sector engagement, the whole of society.
And then use that to have a conversation with the social media companies. Like, we've got a lot of leverage, we can use it.
This is what the Trump State Department and Trump military was paying for. This is during Trump 1.0, underneath their noses. Same conference that organized the I Call Bullshit one. So anyway, I could go on that forever. Maybe I asked AI for a quick and dirty summary, just so you can see a little bit of what I'm talking about here, because this is on the board of NED as we speak. This is one of the 12 or whatever board members who vote to give Damon Wilson his salary higher than the president of the United States. This is one of the guys who votes for whether or not to fire Damon Wilson. So I'm saying, like, it's hard to regime change NED because the regime change would have to be done through the board. Unless you dissolve it, it has to be done through the board. And the board is people like Dan Fried, Victoria Nuland, Tim Kaine, Rachel Kleinfeld, who we'll get to. Now, Dan Fried even targeted Jack Posobiec. You guys may remember this report that I've highlighted many times. Democratic Defense Against Disinformation by Dan Fried and Alina Polyakova. Out of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. This is their disinformation heat map. All these Russian accounts, but the biggest ones are actually Westerners. WikiLeaks and Jack Posobiec. This is in 2018, I believe. February 2018. This is just 1 year into the Trump admin. And Dan Fried is insinuating that Jack Posobiec is the biggest disinformation agent that democracies must be defended against. Why? Well, because Jack Posobiec was on social media promoting the so-called Macron leaks published by WikiLeaks that were being amplified in the election contest between Marine Le Pen, the right-wing Trump-aligned populist, and Emmanuel Macron, the blob sock puppet that Dan Fried and Alina Polyakova and the Atlantic Council and the National Endowment for Democracy wanted to win. So the target was not the Russians. The target was American citizens who were amplifying pro-Marine Le Pen content and fucking up the blob's ability to control the elections in France. That's Dan Fried. Sweet looking old man. Dan, did you think before you did this? If you're listening, Dan, did you think about Jack and his wife and his kids? And what happens when your extremely powerful organization with 7 CIA directors on its board that has touch points into all of the trust and safety teams, the Atlantic Council was made a trusted flagger at Facebook, at YouTube, and Twitter. Did you think about the damage you were doing to an American citizen? An American citizen paying your organization, by the way. Jack Posobiec's income taxes pay the Atlantic Council, your organization, 11 different ways, 11 different government agencies. Collect Jack Posobiec's tax dollars and then give them to you at the Atlantic Council. 3 different divisions of the military, the State Department, USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, Even the fucking Department of Housing and Urban Development takes money from Jack Posobiec to give to you, and you put a target on his back, despite a First Amendment, and despite all your talk about Russian disinformation. We defend democracy against our own citizens. There's so much on this. Literally, we could do 20 hours, and there could be a whole book just written about the trials of Ambassador Fried. But now, Alina Polyakova, they were such a funny tag team together, Dan and Alina. Alina was at the Atlantic Council, then she went over to CEPA, Center for European Policy Analysis. It's unbelievably fucked. CEPA is heart of darkness. It's so insane. I don't even want to spiral into it. But it was very funny because Alina was young. I'll just show you. This is Alina Polyakova, president and CEO of CEPA now. Came up in the world. Wow. I remember seeing that, actually. But they were such a funny pair, these two. Alina Polyakova, you know, she looks like, we played that Jack Reacher clip or whatever. There's like a standard CIA guy look. There's like young stud CIA look, and then there's like older glasses, tweedish suit, thin glasses. And then there's like, I mean, straight out of, extras on set for, class of recruits, yada, yada. I don't know. But what's so funny is they made such an interesting pair together because Dan Fried, and you have to remember, this was many, many years ago. I mean, this is 2017. They were a tag team for about 3 or so years. They worked together on all these disinformation censorship operations. And it was just so funny that these two were always paired together. And in a way, to their credit, they kind of worked well as a duo in the sense that Dan Fried was the brain about how to structure the censorship industrial complex. And he knew that social media was the problem. It was what got Trump elected. It's what made Brexit happen. It's what made Bolsonaro win. It's what made Orban popular. It's what made the Vox Party and the AfD party popular. He knew that social media had to be neutralized, but he didn't really understand pop culture, virality, how fucking TikTok even works. And you had Alina Polyakova, who is this kind of young, up and coming, doesn't really know how the system works like Dan Fried does, but can answer all of Dan's questions about virality, circuit breakers, and how algorithms work and what kind of clusters, the topography of a social media network map of influencers and secondary retweeters, and what the ball of yarn topography of a narrative network looks like. So it's fascinating during those years when I was totally incognito watching all of this, to watch this dynamic duo in action. You could have a kind of anti-hero sitcom about these two, frankly. One of the things that they stressed was using their leverage to bring social media firms to the table, to negotiate with the governments to get rid of populist speech. They pressured the platforms around advertising revenue. It was this transatlantic coalition. NED, it looks like 2018 is when he joined the board of directors at NED. Another funny thing that happened in this period is that NED became monomaniacally obsessed with social media censorship in about March 2018. If you go into the archive.org and you look at a screenshot of March 2016 versus March 2018 on NED's YouTube page, you'll see by early 2018, it went from a whole range of geopolitical topics, sanctions, labor movements, youth engagement, to by early 2018, every video on their YouTube was all about disinformation, misinformation, social media, populists abusing algorithms, the whole of society posture that was needed. Whole of society. creating political pressure to drive terms of service changes at the social media platforms, using the combined leverage of the US and EU to push for transparency and accountability, which means prying them open and then punishing them. He was a witness for the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Russian disinformation, treating the EU Code of Practice on Disinformation as a model. The EU Code of Practice on Disinformation was folded into what is now the EU Digital Censorship Act, the very thing that fined Elon Musk. He wanted regulation of the social media companies, calling for a joint US-EU counter-disinformation coalition to pool leverage across the whole society. In the 2019 NED annual report, it foregrounds disinformation as a core democracy challenge in the technology and information arena and lists Fried as a director. A NED sharp power ecosystem acknowledgement. Sharp power was this concept from Chris Walker, who is really the NED side of the censorship industrial complex. He was the top guy at NED on the censorship industrial complex. We've played Chris Walker clips before at that GlobeSec meeting in 2017, May 2017, for example. Sharp powers is somewhere, it's basically making soft power hit harder. That's kind of how they, you have hard power, which is military connect force, and then you have soft power, which is like controlling the media, controlling influence. The idea of sharp power was it's soft power, but with more muscle. So actually, looks like Dan Fried coined the term sharp power. I thought Chris Walker did. Wow. Looks like Dan Fried did. I was not familiar with your game, Ambassador. What was funny is at the time, in 2017, 2018, he was trying to avoid heavy content-based controls. Of course, that all went out the window with COVID-19 and in the run-up to the Mueller testimony in July 2019. Let's now get back to, wanted to talk about another one of the directors, just so you see what we're up against. Because now that they've got funding, and the question is, okay, well, how can you change the personnel? Here's another one of the board members, Rachel Kleinfeld. Now, this is a real piece of work as well. Now, Rachel Kleinfeld